excited for a few reasons. It's great to be here, obviously. I am in the process of finding a new chair for my sitting room at my house, at my apartment, so I'm going to steal one of these before the day's out. So just real quick, how many people in here are from Chicago? By a round of applause, because these lights are bright as fuck. I can't really... Okay. So that's a lot of y'all. They stay lying about us in this moment, you know? And I find that really perplexing, and of course, you know, I'm angered by that. Like the head Cheeto in charge, that dude, do you know what I mean? Like anytime he says the city's name, you know, I feel like, you know, it's a personal affront. I also feel like it is the maintenance of a long story of white supremacy and dehumanization when it comes to young people, particularly of color in this city. And so part of what I want to do today is talk about how some of our work at Young Chicago Authors and Louder Than a Bomb. How many people have heard of Louder Than a Bomb, by the way? Okay, good. So some of y'all, cool. All right. So I'm going to tell that story a little bit about how we created this youth poetry festival in Chicago, which has now become the largest youth poetry gathering on the planet. I'm going to do it from the framework of wanting to counter these horrific and I think problematic myths and lies that are told about our city, and particularly our young people in this city. So I got to go back to do that. I feel like, you know, folks in here are my age, maybe some younger heads, maybe some older heads, not pointing out any names. I'm 42, right? So I'm a grown-ass man. That's what that means. I was raised, thankfully, in, I think, you know, such an exciting era. I was a latchkey kid. Any latchkey kids in the house? Anyone came home to just like nothing? 4 of y'all. That's what's up. Good. I'm glad everyone else had a stable 2-parent home. That's what's up. That's good. I mean, hey, look, I mean, I'm proud of you. I'm glad your parents could figure it out. Mine really could not. I came up in such a weird and an exciting era, you know. I was born in 75, and, you know, my first experience with hip hop music. Any hip hop heads in the audience, by the way? Anyone even? Okay. 7 of you. Good. All right, good. We have a lot of explaining. It's going to be quick. The other like 90 something that didn't clap. You've heard of hip hop, right? All right, good. No, I'm just checking. We just got to be on the same page. That's excellent. I first heard hip hop you know, in probably 1982, you know. There was The Message, Grandmaster Flash, and the Furious Five. Maybe you know the hook, don't push me because I'm close to the... I'm trying not to lose my head. Yeah, all right, so you already know. See? My official paid hype woman in the building, so thank you so much. I appreciate you. Sorry that check didn't clear last time, but we're good this time around. That's a haiku, by the way. I didn't know that until I really wrote down that language. But Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, and particularly Melly Mel, who wrote that hook and wrote the verse about a deindustrializing South Bronx, which I didn't know the language at the time, but that song is about, you know, broken glass everywhere, people pissing on the corner, man, they just don't care, right? And so, first of all, that sounds really cool because it rhymes, and I was 7 or 8, and I'm like, I like language that rhymes, you know what I mean? I thought that was very, very fresh. It also reminded me of the neighborhood that I was born in Chicago, you know, because there was a lot of empty lots, and there was a lot of like debris in the front yards. I was born in a neighborhood that doesn't exist anymore called Newtown. You know, my family was like the white folks on the block. It was originally a home of the Young Lords, mostly Puerto Rican street organizers, and also a lot of black folks. And now it's East Lakeview or Boys Town, and that neighborhood changed, and we saw it change a little bit. But being 7 and hearing that song, I was delighted by the rhymes. And then, you know, I heard and watched this film Style Wars that came on PBS in '84. One of my favorite documentaries of all time, exploring the early innovations of New York hip-hop cultural practice, particularly the aesthetics of visual arts, the graffiti that you would see on trains that eventually the MTA and the city of New York and the rest of the planet began to criminalize. But that vibrancy, when I saw it as now a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old from the television set, receiving that global export in my house via the TV, via the boom box that I was listening to. I don't know if y'all had boom boxes, but that was my babysitter as a kid, do you know what I mean? And kept me from trouble in some ways, got me in trouble in other ways. But seeing that vibrancy, I felt like, okay, well, this is a culture that is directed by young people, seems incredibly profound and interesting and innovating and dangerous and exciting. And what 10-year-old doesn't want to be involved in all of that, you know? So I played basketball. I played pretty serious basketball, throughout the entirety of most of my teenage into my early 20s. And I went to a really incredible spot called Doug Collins Basketball Camp. You all remember the old Bulls coach, right? That was like right before the era that we had 6 rings and Chicago Bulls were the greatest team ever. And now they are what they are. But the point is that in the day, Doug Collins Basketball Camp was this venue for kids from the city and kids from the suburbs to get together for a week and play ball and not have any like cross intercultural experience or training or warning. Do you know what I mean? They just threw us all together. They're like, all right, y'all, good luck. And it was great. And of course, we made a bunch of mistakes and we're idiot young kids. But one of the things that I got in that camp, other than an incredible education, and Mike Finley from Chicago dunked over my man Jeff Hoffenberg, jumped over him and dunked on him. Shout out to Jeff Hoffenberg. He probably doesn't want me to repeat that story. But the thing that I got in that camp is one of my roommate's older brothers gave him a BDP mega mixtape. Boogie Down Productions is a crew from the South Bronx and Brooklyn in New York. Their lead MC is a teacher and a poet named KRS-One, which is an acronym for Knowledge Reigns Supreme Over Nearly Everyone. And I was 12, 13 years old at this time. And KRS-One on this mega mixtape that I got said incredible things. You know, on why is that? He says, Genesis chapter 11, verse 10 explains the genealogy of Shem. Shem was a black man in Africa. If you repeat that fact, they can't laugh at you. Genesis 14, verse 13, Abraham steps on the scene. Being a descendant of Shem, which is a fact, means Abraham too was black. And I was studying for my bar mitzvah at the time. I should have said that. And I went... So after summer camp and like memorizing that verse and that song, you know, the first thing I did once I got back to Hebrew school, of course, I popped out of my rabbi, you know what I mean? And I was like, Lashana Tova, by the way, 5777 in the building. 3 Jews in the building, that's fine. I know there are more of y'all. You can't really, in all these spaces, say it. I understand. It's fine. And I was like, yo, rabbi, and I kicked that verse from him, you know what I mean? And I was like, what you think about that, Rabbi? And he was like, you have to leave the synagogue. Do you know what I mean? And so like, which in truth was dope, because I'm like, oh, you don't have to tell me twice. I hate Hebrew school. I'm out. You know what I mean? But I knew that there was like a power in countering like a dominant narrative. Do you know what I mean? Like I got in trouble for saying something from KRS-One that I believed to be true, that is factual. There was a problem in telling the truth in a public sphere, right? And so, of course, that put like a giant chip on my shoulder. I was already a working class kid, now moved out to the suburbs, went to Glenbrook North High School, saw a lot of my peers in like McMansions with Chevy Blazers at 16, and my mom was addicted to cocaine and working 2 or 3 jobs to keep us in this area. And I was working, you know, since I've been 11 years old. And so I already had a giant chip on my shoulder. But hip hop sent me to the library, thank God, to learn and fuel some of my misgivings with what I was being taught in the classroom, right? KRS-One, Chuck D, MC Lyte, Queen Latifah, X-Clan, Poor Righteous Teachers, A Tribe Called Quest, all folks that they were on record saying names I didn't know, and I was going to the library in order to find out what they were saying, and what I was learning in the library was very counter to what I was getting in my classroom. You know, in America, they still teach us that Columbus discovered America. Like, still teach us this? Like, we still have Columbus Day? Do you know what I mean? Like, 1492, dude was a colonist, a rapist, and a slave owner, and now we're still, like, marching down. Like, obviously, we know that's corny. Do you know what I mean? And problematic and racist and a revision of, you know, what history is. And so, as a teenager, right, first row, junior year, American history class, I already read on my own that summer the autobiography of Malcolm X, Lerone Bennett Jr.'s Before the Mayflower, History of Black America, Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States of America, and an anthology I'll talk about in a minute called The Black Poets. But, you know, first row, first period, I'm like this in the front row. You know what I mean? I don't even think the teacher came into class. Do you know what I mean? I'm just sitting there like just so excited to like battle, because I'm also raised in hip hop culture. So I'm really, in my mind, I'm like a battle MC. And he's like, yes, Mr. Coval. I'm like, Mr. Rossholt, why are there only dead white dudes on the wall? He's like, Mr. Coval, the dean's office is that way. Do you know what I mean? And so just using like what I perceive to be truth to counter a dominant narrative and getting in trouble for it. And so in some ways, those next 2 years of high school, that's all I did. You know, I played basketball and we were really good. We were third in my senior year in the state of Illinois. So like the school was like, oh, you are in trouble, but good job Friday night. It was confusing because I was spending a lot of time in the dean's office, spending a lot of time on the basketball court, not really going to class, and certainly not wanting to engage with the Eurocentric canon that I was getting in my English and in my history class. And so I took it upon myself to want to learn. And then hip hop, because it's a culture of a call and response, it gave a generation of young people the permission to begin to narrate and articulate their own story. And so what did I do? I started to write battle rhymes to my teachers. Like really like just battle rap essays. Be like, yo, Mr. Rossholt, you so whack. I was not good, but the point is like, that's how I got started, you know, and I found a power and a sanctity and a sanctuary in my ability to begin to kind of put my own ideas on the page. And of course, hip hop and the boombox was my mirror and my solace and my homies in some ways, you know. I went away to college for a few years. It didn't work out for me in college. I teach college now, which is the irony, but I've been kicked out or dropped out of 4 or 5 different fine institutions across this country. But I played basketball overseas in Wales in 1995, semi-pro ball, which does not say a lot about my basketball ability. It does say more about the lack of excellence in ball at that time in Wales. No shots at the Welsh. I mean, they could ball now. I understand that. But at the time, I was playing point guard. I had no business playing point guard. But the point is, I came back to Chicago in 95, 96, and knew that I wanted to write. I knew that I wanted to be a writer, and I got very lucky because I moved into a neighborhood in Wicker Park at that time, 95, and if you know the history of that neighborhood, it was also in that process of beginning to change and gentrify, but my whole life revolved around that neighborhood. My grandfather came from the Ukraine, fleeing the Cossacks, and moved onto 1750 West Haddon, just south of Division, in 1906 to save him and his family's life. And so my whole life revolved around that neighborhood, and I felt, pretty okay about moving in. And I found myself right in the middle of this emergent spoken word hip hop scene that was beginning to like have an impact in the culture of that neighborhood and in the culture of Chicago. And so I began running around as a writer. For that year, 2 years, I thought for sure my name was that white dude. Do you know what I mean? Because the people were just like, man, I don't know, but that white dude's here again. Do you know what I mean? And like, in some ways I wore it like a badge. And then eventually people asked me my name, which was nice, and welcomed me, which was great. And I started to run around and meet people and meet the kind of community that I was beginning to hear on record that I dreamed about as a kid, like this community of hyper literate word nerds who were like very excited about language and musicality and the sound of each syllable, like Miss Brooks was, but through like the idiom of hip hop cultural practice. And I began to find and build a community. And eventually, one of my good homies, an incredible Chicagoan and man named Ibu Patel, he was teaching at the time at an alternative high school on the west side of Chicago called El Corto Año. He understood what I was doing in the clubs and in the bookstores and whatever, as a performer, as a writer. He's like, yo, will you come and do a workshop with my students? I'm like, no. That's a horrible idea. What? No, I'm the worst student in the world. You want me to go back to school? I just got out of school. I hate school. He's like, well, I'll take you to lunch. I'm like, I'm starving. So let's go. And so I went into the classroom, and I was 21 at the time. The students were 18, 19 years old. I went in 2 weeks after an incredible event. The 7 hip-hop heads in the audience will know this. 2 weeks after the Fugees' second record, The Score, just came out. Right, so this is like Lauryn Hill and Pras, it's okay, and Wyclef, and they put out this incredible record. I know, Pras, I feel bad. he isn't that good. So the point is that Lauryn Hill said, like, I gets controversial, freak a style with no rehearsal. Ooh, contraire, mon frere. Don't you even go there. Me without a mic is like a beat without a snare. I dare to tear into your ego. We go way back like some ganja and Palico or Calico vision. My mind's making incision, anatomy, and I back this with Deuteronomy or Leviticus. God made this, you can't get with it. It's sweet like licorice, dangerous like syphilis. Yeah, and we were like, what? What? And for an hour and a half, all we did was like just nerd out about how nice Lauryn Hill is with it. And I think I might have brought in like a few Gwendolyn Brooks poems, because the same way Lauryn Hill like was delighting in the syllable, Miss Brooks also like gave us that lineage to really like wring sound out of each word. And so after the class, I apologized to Ibu. I'm like, don't worry, man. Like, I got lunch. I'll see you around. He's like, no. You should teach. I'm like, I just apologize, man. Like, you don't have to be an asshole. Do you know what I mean? Like, he's like, you should do a residency. I'm like, that sounds fancy. He's like, we'll pay you. I'm like, I'm there. So that's how I started teaching. So from 96 to 2000, 2001, I taught in alternative high schools all around Chicago. I taught at the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, and I was excited because I was finding like a new community that was as excited about Miss Brooks as they would be Lauryn Hill, or as excited about Hakeem Madhubuti or Frank O'Hara as they would be about Chuck D or whoever we were listening to. My whole life I was waiting for that crew, for that community, and I was finding them in the classroom space. In 2000, 2001, a few things happened. One, I began to be in conversation with a crew of incredibly committed classroom teachers and teaching artists like myself who are running around to schools a little bit, doing some teaching artistry in alternative and public education spaces. And in 2000 and 2001, we were having this conversation about the city and our students and our teaching style. And these things happened. The towers fell. And America continued its constant progression of criminalization and war against brown people around the planet. And then at the same time, the city of Chicago was trying to pass an anti-gang loitering law that was locking up young people, particularly young people of color, for hanging out in groups of more than one. And because I was teaching at County and also in the school, I saw the school to prison pipeline made manifest on a weekly basis. I would see a kid like in my class on Tuesday, and I'd show up to County on Thursday, and I'd be like, my man, what happened? And he'd be like, I was like we were waiting, my grandma was making dinner, and I was with my cousin, and now I'm here. I'm like, true, but really what happened, my dude? He's like I said, I was waiting on dinner from my grandma, and the cops came on the block, and now I'm here. And so I was like, well, shit. We need to do something to correct that. How do we do that? And so because Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the world, and because we have difficulty really believing one another when it comes to the viaducts that we live apart, the viaducts that we can't cross, the intentionality of urban planners to keep working people of color away from one another. In that moment of fear and chaos, this community of educators and poets and young people wanted to create a countercultural space that would have a different ethos at the core of its function. And so we created this moment, this night, that we called Louder Than a Bomb, the Chicago Youth Poetry Festival. We did it in a basement in Wicker Park at the Chopin Theater, if you know where that is, near the Polish Triangle or Algren Square. We can't get geometry right. And we did it in the basement. We had 150 people and like 4 teams of high school poets, teams of poets, like you do basketball, but it was poets competing against one another. And we broke fire code, and it was sweaty, and it was dope. And I walked away from that night being like, all right, y'all, I'll see you guys around. Thank you so much. It was a great night. And people were like, my man, when's next year? I want to start getting our school ready. I want our school to participate. I'm like, what? They're like, right, so that was cool, dope, hey, congratulations. But like next year, so we can start preparing now, like when is it going to happen? And I'm like, damn, y'all don't stop. Do you know what I mean? And so we started with a handful of teams in the basement. 18 years later now, Louder Than a Bomb has 110 teams all over the Chicagoland area. You can have about 10 kids on a team. You get to have like 1 billion kids in an after-school poetry club. And now, 18 years later, a few things have happened. One, young poets in high schools in this city walk around their hallways like they're star athletes. And you don't have to, I appreciate that, but that's like the nerdiest shit in the world, right? Like that's like imagine like when we were kids, poets would get put in the locker, do you know what I mean? And now they walk the hallways because they're performing at assemblies, or they're performing at homecoming functions, or they're performing at like a teacher's professional development. And the poets, these hyper-literate word nerds who are engaged in the same kind of hip-hop poetics that delighted me as a young person, are now putting on for their own stories and their own communities because they refuse to be lied about. They're telling their own most authentic self to counter the dominant narratives that are being leveled against them from on high to like in the local area. And we intentionally use that tool of spoken word, of hip-hop poetry, to bring together every imaginable young person in the city. That's what we do. It's a tool of community organizing on par with how the Black Arts movement saw the tool and the use of culture, mixed with the work of Saul Alinsky, mixed with the work of Ida B. Wells, mixed with the work of the organizers who put on for the Harold Washington campaign. It is on us as Chicagoans, as artists, as educators, as thinkers, as citizens of the city, to imagine a city that is going to be more equitable and fresher and more just for all of us moving forward. And that's part of the work we do for real. So thank you so much.